Well. So Zame wants the Seattle Kraken to tank. Do you know how many teams with a number one pick since the 2015 draft have won a Stanley Cup in that span? None. Not one single team. But sure. Let's tank.
You are Locked On Kraken, your daily podcast on the Seattle Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Seattle hockey fans. Welcome to another episode of Locked On Kraken, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we bring you your favorite team, the Seattle Kraken, every single day. Erica L. Ayala here, your host of Locked On Kraken. And we got some things to talk about. Thanks to Zame for taking over the Friday show, trying to get him more integrated here. And I gotta address this. As some of you rightfully mentioned in the YouTube comments on YouTube. Yeah, I'm not down for the tanking. I completely agree in one of the comments saying that the mediocrity needs to end with the Seattle Kraken. And it's true. The Seattle Kraken are in a dangerous place right now. Perhaps a lot of people feel is a dangerous place where it's a limbo. We've heard analysts write about limbo for teams that are not good enough to make the playoffs, but also not bad enough to have the best odds. Now, odds don't guarantee a top pick, but as they say, the odds are ever in your favor. I did also listen to the audiobook of Suzanne Collins' new prequel to the Hunger Games. Highly recommend. Anyway, it's another side of the social media. Anyway, back to the Seattle Kraken. I don't want to see them play mediocre. Absolutely not. This is not a team that can win right now. And I do think it's worth noting that Zame on Friday's episode noted that tanking doesn't usually come from players. I think you can argue that here and there, but it comes from front offices. And given how I feel about the front office and the peculiar things that just don't seem to add up, maybe, yes, that is where this uncomfortable limbo situation for the Seattle Kraken, maybe that's where that's coming from. But I want to break some things down. As I mentioned in the cold open, since 2015, the 2015 entry draft, so going on 10 drafts, right? There have been no teams with the number one pick in any of those drafts that have gone on to win a Stanley Cup. The closest, I guess you could say, would be Edmonton. And not just because they competed last year, but Edmonton also in that span since 2015 has appeared in a conference finals. And of course, the Stanley Cup final last year. Now, in that span, we also have seen San Jose go to the conference finals twice in 2016 and 2019, but that was before they got their number one pick in Celebrini. We also saw the New York Rangers go to the conference finals in 2015 and in 2024 last year. But the 2015 run was before Lafreniere and before one of our guys now, Capo Caco. Stanley Cup final, it's only been, two teams outside of, again, Edmonton. So you've got Montreal and San Jose, but San Jose, that was 2016 before they were hashtag Team Tank. Montreal in 21. So why am I breaking these things down? Because you say you want to tank, but are you also willing to have to wait a decade or more for a Stanley Cup? Are you willing to do that? I mean, maybe the answer is yes. I think there's another way. And I actually alluded to this in some of what we're hearing in the NBA regarding Oklahoma City, regarding teams like Cleveland. And also I want to relate this to Edmonton. But so let me back up here. So why did I start with the 2015 draft? Well, in in 2015, at the 2015 draft, things changed a little bit with the draft lottery, including that teams could move up any number of spots in the lottery. We'll get to why that's a little different now. And the lottery winner was guaranteed the first overall pick. That was between 2013 and 2015, right before the 2015 draft. In 2015 through 2020, the top 3 picks were determined by the lottery, with teams able to move up a maximum of 3 spots. And then in 2021, the draft changed again, and only the top 2 spots were determined by the lottery, teams able to move up a maximum of 2 spots. In 2022, once again, we saw some changes where teams could move up a maximum of 10 spots, meaning only the bottom 11 teams based on the regular season points are eligible for the first overall pick. And now we also have in 2022 and beyond, a team can only win the lottery, or a team can win the lottery no more than twice in a 5-year span. Now, the Seattle Kraken have not won the lottery yet, aka get the first overall pick. So I suppose if you were Team Tank, you could say, well, let's tank for 5 years. I guess you could say that. Get our number 1 picks and then get after it. Sure. Cool. Tight. But again, only Edmonton has been able to do that and get to the Stanley Cup final, that is, not win a title. They have not won a title since 2015. I also do want to mention that Edmonton did get, so they got Connor McDavid in the 2015 entry draft. The year before that, they got Draisaitl at the number 3 pick. And the year before that, they got Darnell Nurse as the number 7 pick. And I want you to remember that, because we're actually going to talk about Edmonton and how they've built their team a little bit more in the next segment. But if you are Team Tank, I hope you're also team, I might have a 20-year-old before I see my team win a Stanley Cup, because that's what you're talking about. Not to mention all of the things that I've already talked about on why I don't like tanking, that I think it messes up the mentality of an athlete. I don't know that, I would argue that it also doesn't allow a team to build, establish, and refine culture if they're focused on losing a calculated number of games, so that they can be draft lottery, have better odds in the draft lottery. When you have players, prospects coming up that need to get a feel for the NHL game, they need to get a feel for what it takes to win NHL games in the regular season, because newsflash, even if you do get to the playoffs as a team that's won the draft lotto in the last 10 years prior to you getting to the playoffs, you have to know how to win a playoff series. And you don't learn how to win in the playoffs by losing in the regular season, by actively trying to lose in the regular season. I don't know that that's really, I don't know that I have to explain that, right? It defies logic. You learn how to win by losing? Who says that ever, anywhere? And maybe you don't want to lean into the mentality of it. Maybe you are leaning more into the strategy. And again, Zane did mention that there is a lot of strategy. It's front office strategy. Now, of course, that trickles down. It has to, right? To the coaching staff, to the players themselves. It just seems like a really high gamble to ruin your culture, to create a situation where you're not preparing your prospects to win in the regular season, let alone in the playoffs. And it makes an assumption that you actually know what you're doing in the draft. Now, the Seattle Kraken, I think, do have a good handle on prospects and culture. And as I mentioned, Edmonton got Darnell Nurse in 2013, Draisaitl in 2014, and then Connor McDavid in 2015. Connor McDavid, though, the only first overall pick there. Again, Draisaitl at number 3, Darnell Nurse at number 7. So that's 3 consecutive years. So that's where I guess, the tanking kind of conversation that's where you can have it. But again, Edmonton, if you allow for 2014 and 2015, Edmonton is the only team among team tank teams, right? Bottom dwelling teams that has been even remotely close to having a key part of their core, the elements of their core, Draisaitl and McDavid, obviously, and I think some people would also argue for Darnell Nurse. There's no other team since 2015 that's even remotely close to getting their core through the entry draft the way that Edmonton did. So again, Edmonton, the only team to have a number one pick from 2015 and beyond to make a Stanley Cup final within that span. So in the last 10 years, they did it last year and they still didn't win. Went down to the wire against Florida, lost in game 7. Great series, but they're still waiting. So does Team Tank just sound good? Or are you really willing to sacrifice a decade of potentially sacrifice potential? The point is, I don't know that tanking is any more of a clear path since 2015. I want to emphasize that because I took into account that the draft rules changed. I just don't see that as a more surefire thing than being able to really work up your prospects, find the right pieces to surround your key and core players, and or go find some core players. I think maybe you try to meet in the middle. So no, I'm not Team Tank, and I don't think you should be either. But I want to break down a little bit more about why I think the Seattle Kraken, not just because of a sign of the times, but also because of how this team does scout, draft, and develop talent, that we shouldn't lean into Team Tank. And there's another approach that's coming up on today's episode of Locked On Kraken. Today's episode of Locked On Kraken brought to you by our friends at Wonderful Pistachio. If you're looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious, you should crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is the highest protein nuts. Each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling fuller for longer. You know, I also want to mention that there is a no-shell variety. It's perfect for a grab-and-go snack, whether you're recording and editing a bunch of podcasts like I do, or maybe something before the gym, after the gym. There's always something that you can grab on the go for a quick protein boost. And right now, you can get snackin' and get crackin', Seattle Kraken fans, with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more. And thanks as always for making Locked On Kraken a part of your daily destination. Erica L. Ayala here, telling you why I vehemently disagree, with the idea and the concept of tanking. Zame is Team Tank. He told you so. And you know what? The Seattle Kraken lost their most recent game. But here's the thing, right? We also heard that Zame talked about, should Shane Wright be getting more minutes? First of all, I do think Shane Wright should get more minutes. I don't always completely understand some of the decision-making that the coaching staff makes. And, you know, the Seattle Kraken are in a little bit of a tough spot here, making all of the trades that they did. And so if you want to make the argument that Shane Wright is maybe not getting as many minutes as he should, whatever the case is, I mean, you have to also look at this roster. We have Jared McCann playing center once again. You know, everyone's kind of playing, or not everyone, but there are a decent amount of players that are kind of just filling in here. And, I don't know if it's a message being sent to Shane Wright. I mean, we also know that he got hit pretty hard by Brandon Tanev, talked about that. We haven't heard that he's dealing with any injury. He hasn't been, as Dan Bilesma sometimes says, air quotes for my audio folks, maintenancing. We haven't heard that he's been maintenancing. And if it's a minor thing that's maybe a discomfort but not a concern, that's not something that Dan Bilesma is going to tell us. As Zame has alluded to, he's not happy with how Dan Bilesma talks about injuries. I mean, I don't think you can say Dan Bilesma is the only one who's mysterious about hockey injuries, but he's been very bullish about not saying much about Chandler Stevenson. So if he won't talk about something where we clearly saw a player leave the ice, not return to the game, I don't think he's going to help us along with anything with regard to Shane Wright. I also think Dan Bilesma is showing a little bit of frustration in how he's talking about certain things. Completely understandable. And honestly, I thought the guy has handled things pretty well so far. But why did I want to talk a little bit about Shane Wright and maybe what the difficulties of the roster situation are now is because I don't believe in team tank. I don't think that you should ever allow it to enter into the psychology of your players that we can lose games now and do just enough now to be better in the future. I also think, I mean, maybe it's just how I think. That's kind of low-key disrespectful. Like, I'd feel low-key disrespected. It's like, oh, you don't think you can win with us? Okay, cool, tight. But I do think that tanking where the Seattle Kraken are, which is in that limbo area, Zame had this up the other day. We're looking at, I actually don't know exactly where he got this from, but whether it's this chart here or if we look at Money Puck, for example, and where they have the Seattle Kraken with regard to the playoff race, the Seattle Kraken are just in a weird spot where we're not a team that has great odds when it comes to getting the draft, the draft pick, and we're not close enough to be able to be a competitor. If we look across the NHL, the Seattle Kraken is in the bottom rung with Philadelphia, Buffalo, and the Nashville Predators, but we are not as far, to the bottom at a point per game pace as Chicago and San Jose. So they're immediately going to have better odds to win the draft than the Seattle Kraken. Now, I mentioned, I think it was the Lafreniere draft where the Rangers actually didn't have the best odds to win the draft lottery, but they did win the draft lottery. And so it's not impossible, but it's very improbable. And so, if we look at trying to tank where we are roughly, 12 games? How many? We've got the Seattle Kraken have 11 games left in the season. Do you think they can tank hard enough to catch up to Chicago and San Jose? No, they can't. They can't. And here's another graphic, this also coming from Money Puck. They're not going to catch up to San Jose. They're not going to catch up to Chicago. If they were going to join the tank party, they probably should have done it already. They have enough games to separate from Buffalo, Philly, and Nashville. And, sure, you could say that. But again, as I mentioned in my other segment, you tank, you put in all of this work, you have all of these, hush-hush conversations, you create a culture where you want to lose, and now you don't get the number one pick. Or maybe you do get the number one pick. And then maybe you get it in another, 2, 3, 4 years. As long as you get another one in the next 5 years, according to the new rules, you're good. But if we only look at what has happened since 2015, there's no guarantee that you're even going to make the Stanley Cup final, let alone win a Stanley Cup. That's just not what we're seeing with the odds being what they are. And we can't go by what happened before 2015 because the Seattle Kraken do not live in a world, unless things change, where they are beholden to those rules. They are not beholden to the rules of the draft before 2015, really before 2022, because they changed again multiple times. I broke that down for you. But for the sake of this argument, trying to have this debate about tanking, it's just not going to happen. It's not going to happen for the Seattle Kraken. And at least for 2025, if we don't get a top 4 pick, not many people really know what to expect when it comes to the rest of the draft. As far as like a game-changing generational talent that can immediately make your team better. And the Seattle Kraken have been able to get some of those players, or so they hope, so they think. Maybe not the number 1 overall pick, Matty Beniers, Shane Wright, Berkeley Catton. And so going back to a conversation we had sometime, I think it was last week, I don't believe in tanking. I think it sets a bad precedent. It just entertains something that you should never entertain into professional sports. It's like we hated the White Sox, right, for rigging the World Series. And then here we are all those years later, a century later, talking about tanking like it's the greatest thing in the world. It's like, come on, man. That's such, as Kobe Bryant would say, weak. It's so weak, I can't even stomach it. I cannot even stomach the idea of tanking. What's that guy? Pete Rose, right? Mad at Pete Rose. And now we're actively doing all of the things that these guys, I mean, baseball's its own level of, yeah, I'll just leave that there. But I don't like the idea of tanking. I don't think it's working particularly well. What has to work, regardless of what pick you get, what has to work is that you draft well, you develop your talent well, and you get the right complementary pieces. That's the conversation I was having about what the OKC Thunder have been able to do, what Cleveland is doing on the NBA side. I mean, I'm a Mets fan. I think you could argue baseball, the Mets have done better hanging on to farm talent. But, we have teams that have been able to be a contender developing through their farm system. And there's an article that I saw. We're going to play Edmonton again, which is also really interesting that we're talking about them because, again, they're the best comp that I can see. But Edmonton right now, Edmonton beat us over the weekend, right? Without McDavid, without Draisaitl. And people weren't sure what it was going to look like. Now, this is still a very top-heavy team. Extremely top heavy. But what we also see is that absent of those guys because of injury, there are players that are able to step up, that they're able to contribute in ways that they really weren't before. And in an article I see in the Edmonton Journal, I mean, you have guys like Ryan Nugent-Hopkins actively talking about, how it feels to be on a team where everyone knows you've got a 1-2 punch that's unstoppable because everyone knows about it, but they still can't stop it. But how do you operate without them? How do you keep the rest of your roster sharp? How do you give them enough confidence and enough repetitions? Hello, Philip Grubauer. Enough repetitions that they can be successful. And that's the balance that Edmonton's trying to figure out. They've been winning games, but I mean, they just played us. So, there's that. How do you move forward in the right way? So I disagree with Zame on tanking. I do agree with him. Let's see more Shane Wright. Let's find a way to impact Capo Caco because he's really being kind of the setup man for Matty Beniers, which we need him to be right now. And I don't want Capo to sacrifice his game for this team. We're seeing, I think I've said it before, I'll say it again. Jared McCann right now is sacrificing his game for the Seattle Kraken. And he's been our top scorer for the last handful of seasons. I don't know if it's a Shane Wright sacrificing his game, if Shane Wright's just on the El Frizzo with with Dan Bilesma, as Zane alluded to. But I do think the Seattle Kraken, they have 11 games to figure out what they want to do realistically with Shane Wright. And you have to allow these guys the opportunity to get minutes, to make mistakes in real time against real NHL competition where you are asking them to really try to win the dang game and not just like give it the old college try. No, try to win. Sharpen that part of your game right now. And then the great thing is, if you have your team going all out, playing to the best of their capabilities, even as you're shifting lines, as you're getting guys integrated into the NHL game, you're going to have a crap ton of film to watch, to send to your guys, to refine as a coaching staff in the offseason. But how do you realistically look at film when you know that whether it was spoken or not, that you've told your team, if we lose a few, it's fine. How does that help with development? Sure, you want a number one pick? Sure, go at it. But when does the tanking stop? When is it enough? At least in the new NHL rules, Gary Bettman and the rest of the board of directors, of governors, has decided that getting a number one pick within 2 in the 5-year span, that's all you get. But you have to win the odds first, which means that you're tanking, which means that you're losing, which means that you don't know realistically what against NHL talent. Because you could say, oh, well, we've got practice. You don't know realistically, especially what your young talent can do against NHL talent in real NHL games. That means something because you told them maybe it doesn't really mean anything. I don't like that. Compare and then add on the odds or what we've seen as the patterns since 2015. You're taking a massive gamble. You're going to find the right guy and just someone's going to hand you a Stanley Cup. Stop it. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to think, especially, maybe in the NBA, you say tanking, you get an 18-year-old comes onto your team, or a one and done guy comes onto your team, generational talent, makes all the difference. Those guys come right to the NBA. NHL, especially Major League Baseball, there is more of a learning curve. You've got number one picks that don't even always come right to the NHL. I just think it's playing with fire and not the right kind of fire. Coming up next, though, let's wrap up this episode because we haven't done a check-in with our Kansas City Mavericks in a little while. We're going to do a check-in on the Firebirds for a little bit later because, playoffs are over for the Kraken. We know that for sure. But if we look at our pipeline and some people that potentially we should be working on their development, they have things to play for, including seeding in the playoffs. Not if they're going to make the playoffs, but where they will fall in the pecking order. Let's talk about that coming up on Locked On Kraken. Today's episode of Locked On Kraken brought to you by our friends at Monarch Money. Ever check your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. And for me, as a small business owner, if I'm ever looking at my bank account and I don't know where my money has gone, that's a massive problem. And that's where Monarch Money comes in. It's your personal CFO giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, investments, and spending in one place. So you stop managing your money and you start building wealth. For me, I really like that I can see my cash flow right away. I even can set specific goals when it comes to my finances. And again, I'm primarily using Monarch Money for my business accounts, and those dashboards have been fantastic. So take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com code and locked on NHL for half off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code locked on NHL for half off your first year. All right, Seattle hockey fans. Hopefully, I made the case for why I think tanking is ridiculous. Not just because I am a intense former athlete who still has a little bit of that edge to her, a little bit of that bite, a little bit of that sandpaper, loves to see my sports with a little bit of PNV, baby. Let's go. But sure, let's look at the trends. Since 2015, Edmonton is the quote success story. But again, 10 years for them to get to a Stanley Cup final. Are you willing to wait that long? Are you willing to endure 10 seasons of hockey worse than what we're seeing now? Presumably, because there's that, you're introducing the idea of intentionally tanking, which, again, maybe the Seattle Kraken are already there. For me, I don't want that. That's not what I want in sports. That's not what I want to see this team do. I want to see them develop their talent. And speaking of talent, they've got an ECHL team here that is top in their division, is going to be, I think, within 5 games or so of officially clinching. And we should be talking about that. So if you look at the standings in the ECHL, of course, you've got our Kansas City Mavericks. I haven't been able to catch them in Tulsa as much as I was hoping this season, but they are right behind the Toledo Walleye, who has already claimed a playoff spot. But your Kansas City Mavericks are sitting with 89 points. They've got 42 wins. Oh, how beautiful that sounds. 16 losses, 4 overtime losses, and 1 shootout loss. So they have a 706 win percentage, also something I'd love to see. And again, I've seen some reporting that they are a few wins away from being able to clinch outright. They are pretty close though, and can probably get a little bit of help along the way. So that has them overall in the Western Conference as the 2 team. But if we look at what's happening in the Mountain Division, Kansas City Mavericks sit at the top of the table with the Tahoe Night Monsters behind them. Again, Kansas City Mavericks have 89 points, and the Tahoe Night Monsters, KNIGHT, Night Monsters, have 81. Tulsa Oilers, definitely looking better than they have in a little while. I just have to mention them because I live in Tulsa, but they have some work to do. They sit in that 4 spot in the Mountain Division. Also mentioning that because last year we saw that Kansas City took on Tulsa in the first round. They didn't quite make it all the way to the finals this year. They fell a little earlier than they wanted. But I do think this is a Kansas City team that's going to be able, to really compete. So if we look at what we're seeing from Kansas City this year, I told you about the wins and losses and all of that. Right now, they have a 21.3% on the power play, 49 goals scored in 230 power play opportunities. They have a 77.4 penalty kill, 178 penalty kills in 230 tries. If we look at some of the players who we see really shining for this team, it's Cade Brochard for sure, 35 goals, 29 assists. I've talked about some of these guys, including Max Andreev, a little bit of a lower goal scoring from him with 16 goals on the season, but he's got 30 assists. I've interviewed him a few times while the team has passed through Tulsa, And we hear a lot from GM and head coach Tad O'Had that he's really got a lot going for him. If we look at the overall stats in the ECHL this year, it's actually Cade, as I mentioned, who is one of the top 10 scorers in the league. Top scorer in the league has 82 points, including 34 goals. Cade is the 9th overall scorer, 64 points. You've got 3 guys that are stuck at 67 just ahead of him. But Cade is right there. Again, those 35 goals. That's not bad at all. He actually has the most goals of anyone in the ECHL right now. But we have guys that have more assists, such as Brandon Hawkins, who again is your points leader overall. But the leading goal scorer comes from your very own Kansas City Mavericks. If we also look at some of what we're seeing from goaltending, now we've seen goaltenders go back and forth when it comes to specifically, obviously, the Firebirds and the Seattle Kraken. But know that if players are moving up to the Seattle Kraken, then there's likely also movement that's happening with your Kansas City Mavericks. And Noah West is one of those players that we saw come in as things were getting fuddled around. He's top 4 when it comes to goals against average, 1.71. His save percentage right now is .930. Not good enough for, top save percentage just quite yet, but he's in the mix for sure. Not top 5, I should say, but he's definitely top 10. And this group of guys, not players that we're likely to see anytime soon for Coachella Valley, but specifically for the Seattle Kraken. But the opportunity to have some meaningful hockey after April 15th is something I'm personally looking forward to. So today was your Kansas City Mavericks Monday spotlight, and we'll get back to our Firebird Fridays. We've had so much change, new coaching staff, really wanted to focus on Seattle. But as the season is dwindling down and we will once again not make the playoffs, why not talk about some of our prospects who are playoff bound? So wanted to start with the ECHL. We'll also break down the Firebirds who were able to snap a little bit of a losing skid. So we'll talk about that later in the week. But hey, I'm team no tank all the way, because you know what? I hold fast, I stay true, and I always say loud and proud, let's go Kraken, as you should too. But be kind to yourself, be kind to one another, and I will catch you on the next episode. Peace out, everybody.